The crystal wineglass slipped from Grace Whitmore's fingers and shattered across the polished marble floor. The sharp crack silenced the entire banquet hall. Dozens of heads turned toward her. At the center of the room, her husband, Adrian Whitmore, stood beside the master of ceremonies, holding the Business Leader of the Year award that had everyone applauding only moments earlier. Instead of looking concerned by the accident, Adrian chuckled and raised his glass. "It's all right," he said with a careless grin. "Grace has always been a little distracted. I suppose that's easy to do when you don't have much responsibility." A few uneasy laughs floated through the room. Grace bent slowly to gather the broken pieces. "Please, Mrs. Whitmore, let the staff handle that," one of the servers said quietly. She smiled politely and stepped back. The master of ceremonies tried to steer the evening back on course. "They always say that behind every successful man is an incredible woman. Adrian, would you like to say a few words about your wife before we conclude the evening?" The audience applauded warmly. Grace looked toward her husband. For a brief second, she believed he would thank her. Instead, Adrian shrugged. "Honestly, I built this company myself." The applause faded. "I mean, let's be realistic. I work 16-hour days. I negotiate the deals. I bring in every dollar. Grace doesn't work. She stays home." Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Adrian laughed again, completely unaware of the expressions around him. "People love to romanticize marriage, but the truth is money keeps the lights on. If we're talking about contribution, financial contribution is what matters." His business partner cleared his throat. "Adrian." But Adrian wasn't finished. "Grace doesn't run the company. She doesn't earn a paycheck. She doesn't contribute financially. Everything we have exists because I worked for it." Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Grace felt every pair of eyes on her. Her younger sister, Victoria, stared at Adrian in disbelief. His own mother lowered her gaze. Even the photographers stopped taking pictures. Finally, Grace lifted her eyes to meet Adrian's. There were no tears. No anger. No trembling voice. She simply smiled. "You're absolutely right." The simplicity of her response somehow made the room even quieter. Adrian gave a satisfied nod, believing he had made his point. The evening continued, but no one spoke to Grace for several minutes. As guests began leaving, Victoria hurried toward her. "Grace, please tell me you're not going to pretend that didn't happen." Grace slipped on her coat. "It's late." "Late? He humiliated you in front of everyone." Grace glanced back at Adrian, who was laughing with investors as if nothing unusual had occurred. "I heard every word. And now I know exactly where I stand." Victoria searched her sister's face. "What does that mean?" Grace smiled softly. "It means I finally believe him." She walked toward the exit without another word. The next morning, Grace woke before sunrise, just as she had every day for the past 11 years. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat quietly by the kitchen window. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about Adrian's schedule. Normally, she would already have reviewed his calendar, confirmed his meetings, answered overnight emails from overseas clients, prepared the documents he needed, checked traffic conditions, reminded him about his medication, and arranged lunch with an important investor. Instead, she simply sipped her tea. When Adrian walked downstairs, he looked around. "Morning." "Good morning. Did you print the contract for today's meeting?" Grace looked up from her book. "No." He frowned. "You forgot." "No. You didn't have time." "I had time." He stared at her. "Then why isn't it ready?" Grace calmly took another sip of tea. "I thought you handled everything yourself." He laughed. "Very funny." She didn't answer. After waiting another few seconds, Adrian shrugged. "I'll print it at the office." He kissed the top of her head absent-mindedly before leaving. The moment the front door closed, Grace returned to reading. No guilt. No panic. Just peace. At Whitmore Developments, Adrian rushed into the conference room moments before meeting several international investors. Print this immediately, he told his assistant, handing over a flash drive. She plugged it into the computer. It's empty. What? There's nothing here. Adrian frowned. Grace always transferred the files before he left home. He searched every pocket. Nothing. The presentation he'd spent 2 weeks preparing wasn't on the drive. He forced a smile. We'll improvise. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. It was the first major presentation Adrian had ever stumbled through. Driving home that evening, he blamed the assistant. If she'd checked the files earlier, if the IT department had updated the system, someone else had to be responsible. Surely not him. The following morning, Adrian rushed downstairs while fastening his watch. Grace, where are my navy cufflinks? She didn't look up from watering the plants. I'm not sure. You always know. I didn't check. He searched every drawer. Every cabinet. Finally, he left wearing a different pair. Halfway to work, his phone rang. It was his secretary. Mr. Whitmore, weren't you supposed to be at the charity breakfast? Adrian's stomach tightened. What breakfast? The Children's Hospital fundraiser. His secretary sounded confused. You've attended every year. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. I never got a reminder. There was a pause. Mrs. Whitmore usually sends one. Adrian ended the call. By lunchtime, social media already carried photos of every major donor, except him. That evening, he walked into the house looking irritated. You didn't remind me. Grace looked up from the novel resting on her lap. About what? The fundraiser. Oh. That's all you have to say? You said I don't contribute. He frowned. What does that have to do with reminding me? I assumed reminders counted as contributing. Adrian sighed dramatically. Grace, you're taking that joke far too seriously. She closed her book. It wasn't a joke. His expression hardened. I didn't mean it like that. You said exactly what you meant. Before he could respond, she stood and walked upstairs, leaving him alone in the living room for the first time in years. He stared after her, annoyed more than concerned. He still believed she would wake up tomorrow and everything would return to normal. He had no idea that the small inconveniences of the last 2 days were only the beginning. Within 72 hours, the life he believed he had built alone would begin falling apart piece by piece, and for the first time since becoming successful, Adrian Whitmore would discover that the most valuable things in his life had never appeared on a paycheck. Adrian barely slept. He kept replaying Grace's words. Asterisk, you said exactly what you meant. Star. He convinced himself she was overreacting. Couples argued. Feelings got hurt. By the weekend, everything would be back to normal. That confidence disappeared before breakfast. He walked into the kitchen expecting the smell of coffee waiting for him. Instead, Grace sat at the table eating yogurt while reading the morning news on her tablet. Morning, she said pleasantly. Morning. He looked around. No coffee. I made some for myself. He blinked. The machine's right there. It is. He waited. She took another bite. Finally, he poured himself a cup. You usually have breakfast ready by now. I know. You didn't feel like cooking. I wasn't hungry. Adrian frowned. You've never done this before. Grace folded her napkin neatly. I've done many things before. She stood and rinsed her bowl. I'm heading to the library. The library? I joined a book club. He looked surprised. Since when? Yesterday. You didn't tell me. You didn't ask. The front door closed softly behind her. Adrian stood alone in the kitchen, irritated by how ordinary everything seemed. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't giving him the silent treatment. She was simply living her own life. For some reason, that unsettled him more than an argument ever could. He glanced at the clock and hurried to the office. The day only became worse. His receptionist rushed toward him the moment he entered. "Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Harrison has been waiting for 20 minutes. Adrian froze. Waiting for what? The property inspection. His heart sank. He had completely forgotten. Mr. Harrison wasn't just another client. He represented an investment group worth millions. Adrian hurried into the conference room. "I'm terribly sorry." The older man stood, buttoning his jacket. "I cleared my schedule for this meeting. I understand." "No, Adrian." The man's voice remained calm. "I don't think you do." He picked up his briefcase. "If punctuality isn't important to you, perhaps this partnership isn't either." Before Adrian could explain, the investor walked away. His assistant approached carefully. "Sir, should I reschedule?" Adrian rubbed his temples. "I'll handle it," but even as he spoke, he knew the opportunity had slipped through his fingers. That evening, he came home exhausted. The living room was spotless. The house wasn't dirty. Grace hadn't abandoned her home. She had simply stopped managing his life. She was in the backyard, planting flowers. He walked over. "We lost a major investor today." "I'm sorry to hear that." "That's it. What would you like me to say?" "You always helped me prepare. You told everyone I didn't run your business." "I was talking about ownership." "You were talking about contribution." He sighed. "Grace." "No, Adrian." Her voice remained gentle. "You've spent years believing your paycheck was the only thing keeping this family together." She brushed soil from her hands. "I'm simply allowing you to experience that belief." She returned to planting. The conversation was over. Friday morning began with another surprise. Adrian opened his closet. Every suit was hanging exactly where it belonged. None had been taken to the dry cleaner. He searched the pockets. Receipts. Business cards. Even an old boarding pass. Grace had always emptied them. Pressed every shirt. Rotated his ties, without ever mentioning it. Now every wrinkle seemed to accuse him. He settled for the least creased suit. As he drove away, his phone buzzed. His younger brother, Ethan. "Don't tell me you forgot." Adrian frowned. "Forgot what?" "Dad's birthday lunch." His eyes widened. "Today?" There was a long silence. "You really forgot." "I've just been busy." So was Grace. "What does Grace have to do with this?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "Everything." The call ended. Adrian stared at the phone. For 11 years, he had never forgotten his father's birthday. Because Grace had never allowed him to. Dinner that evening was painfully quiet. His father barely looked at him. "I wasn't expecting expensive gifts," the older man finally said. "I just expected my son." "I'm sorry. You've never missed my birthday before." Adrian swallowed. "I forgot." His father nodded slowly. "I don't think you did." "What do you mean?" "I think someone stopped remembering for you." Adrian couldn't answer. Across the table, Grace quietly passed the salad bowl. She had remembered the birthday. She simply hadn't reminded him. Saturday morning brought another disaster. Adrian climbed into his car. The fuel tank was nearly empty. He frowned. Grace always filled the tank every Friday because she knew he hated stopping on busy mornings. He drove to the nearest station. Halfway there. The engine sputtered. Then stopped. He stared at the dashboard in disbelief. His phone battery was at 3%. He called roadside assistance. They promised someone within 90 minutes. As he waited under the hot sun, irritation slowly turned into something else. Embarrassment. He remembered all the times he'd joked that Grace worried too much. She checked fuel levels. Insurance renewals. Service appointments. Emergency supplies. He'd teased her for making lists. Now he realized those lists had quietly prevented problems he never even noticed. His phone died. He sat alone. For the first time in years, he had nothing to distract him from his thoughts. Grace spent the afternoon at an art workshop downtown. She laughed with strangers. Painted for the first time since college. Shared coffee afterward. When she returned home carrying a canvas, Adrian looked genuinely surprised. "You paint?" "I used to. I never knew. You never asked." The words hit harder than she intended. Because they were true. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd asked Grace what made her happy. He knew her grocery list. He knew where she kept important documents. He knew which tailor she preferred. But he couldn't remember her favorite author. Or favorite color. Or what dreams she'd quietly buried while helping him chase his own. Monday arrived. Chaos arrived with it. His chief accountant burst into Adrian's office. "We have a problem." "What now?" "The quarterly tax documents." "What about them?" "They weren't submitted." Adrian frowned. "They're always submitted. Mrs. Whitmore usually organizes everything before we file." His stomach tightened. "I thought your department handled taxes." "We do. But she checked every document before we sent them." The accountant hesitated. "This year, no one did." Adrian sank into his chair. The government penalty alone would cost thousands. Worse. A routine audit had now been triggered. He stared blankly at the paperwork. Every hour seemed to reveal another responsibility Grace had quietly carried without recognition. Not because anyone asked her to. Because she loved him. Because she wanted his life to be easier. And he had stood before a room full of people. And called her contribution. Nothing. That evening, he returned home earlier than usual. Grace was curled up on the sofa with a blanket, smiling at a classic movie. She looked peaceful. Happier than she'd seemed in years. Adrian stood in the doorway watching her. For the first time, he noticed something that made his chest tighten. Grace hadn't become colder. She hadn't become cruel. She had simply stopped disappearing into everyone else's needs. And as she slowly rediscovered herself, he was finally beginning to see everything he had spent years overlooking. Yet even then, Adrian still didn't understand the full cost of his words. The biggest collapse was still waiting for him. And when it came, no amount of money, influence, or success would be enough to fix it overnight. Adrian arrived at the office before sunrise, hoping an early start would help him regain control. Instead, he walked straight into another disaster. His operations manager was waiting outside his office, his face pale. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a serious problem." Adrian dropped his briefcase onto his desk. "What happened now?" "The Prescott contract." Adrian's heart skipped. The Prescott project was the biggest development his company had ever secured. If it fell through, months of work and millions of dollars would disappear overnight. "What about it?" "The revised proposal was never sent." Adrian frowned. "That's impossible." "I finished it last week." "You finished writing it," the manager replied carefully. "But it was never reviewed, formatted, or emailed." Adrian opened his laptop. His stomach dropped. The document was sitting exactly where he had left it, unfinished. Normally, Grace would have reminded him to send it, proofread every page, fix the formatting, and asked one simple question before he left the house. Asterisk, did you remember to send the proposal? Star. One question. That was all it would have taken. Instead, the client had waited. Then hired another company. Adrian slowly closed the laptop. No one in the room said a word. For the first time since starting his business, he had no one else to blame. That afternoon, he sat alone in his office long after everyone had gone home. His eyes drifted across the family photo on his desk. It had been taken 6 months earlier during a vacation in the mountains. He remembered complaining because Grace wanted to stop and watch the sunset. "We're wasting time," he had said. She had smiled anyway. "We're making memories." He had rushed everyone back to the hotel so he could answer emails. Looking at the picture now, he couldn't even remember what those emails had been about. But he remembered the disappointment in Grace's eyes. How many moments had he traded for meetings? How many conversations had he ended because work felt more important? And how many times had Grace quietly accepted second place? His phone buzzed. It was Victoria. "How is she?" Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" "My sister. She's fine." "Is she?" He didn't answer. Victoria sighed. "You still don't understand, do you? I made a mistake." "No." Her voice was calm. "You made hundreds of them." He leaned back in his chair. "I apologized." "Did you?" "Not yet." "Then don't confuse regret with an apology." Before he could reply, she continued. "You think this started at that banquet?" "It did." "No, Adrian. It started years ago." He stayed silent. "You stopped noticing her. You stopped asking how her day was. You stopped thanking her. You stopped seeing her. The dinner was simply the first time you said it out loud." The call ended. Adrian stared at the blank screen. Every sentence echoed inside his head. She was right. The banquet hadn't created the problem. It had exposed it. When Adrian pulled into the driveway that evening, he noticed Grace sitting on the front porch with an elderly neighbor. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had recently lost her husband. Grace was listening as the older woman spoke. Really listening. Not checking her phone. Not glancing at the time. Just listening. Mrs. Brooks smiled through tears before hugging Grace. As the older woman walked home, Adrian approached. "What was that about?" "She misses having someone to talk to." "So you spent the afternoon with her?" Grace nodded. "She needed company." He looked at her carefully. "You've always done things like this, haven't you?" She smiled faintly. "I've always tried." He lowered himself into the chair beside her. "I don't think I've noticed half the things you do." Grace looked out toward the quiet street. "I know." The silence between them wasn't angry anymore. It was honest. After several minutes, Adrian spoke again. "I used to believe success meant earning more every year. And now? I don't know anymore." Grace didn't answer. She simply waited. For once, she wasn't rescuing him from an uncomfortable moment. She was allowing him to sit with it. The next morning brought the final blow. Adrian arrived at work to find several department heads gathered outside the conference room. His assistant hurried toward him. "Sir." "What is it?" "The board meeting." "What about it?" "They've already started." His face drained of color. "The meeting is tomorrow." She shook her head. "It was moved forward last month." He remembered. Grace had mentioned changing it on the family calendar. He had barely looked up from his phone. "I'll remember." He hadn't. The board members questioned his recent performance. They pointed to missed deadlines. Lost clients. Declining confidence. One director spoke bluntly. "This isn't the Adrian Whitmore we've known." He couldn't argue. Because it wasn't. For years, people had praised his flawless organization. His incredible memory. His reliability. Now he realized those compliments had never belonged to him alone. Someone had been protecting that reputation every single day. Quietly. Without applause. Without recognition. Without expecting anything in return. That night, Adrian didn't go straight inside when he arrived home. He sat in his car for almost an hour. He thought about the tiny apartment where he and Grace had started with almost nothing. She had worked double shifts while he tried to build a business. She had sold her grandmother's antique piano so they could pay rent one winter. When his first office flooded, she spent an entire weekend drying paperwork with a hairdryer because they couldn't afford replacements. When he lost confidence, she reminded him why he had started. When his first major contract finally came through, she celebrated harder than he did. Not once had she asked for credit. Not once. Somewhere along the way, he had mistaken her silence for insignificance. And that realization hurt more than every business loss combined. He finally walked inside. Grace was setting 2 plates on the dining table. She had cooked a simple meal. Nothing extravagant. She looked up. "You're home early." "I needed to be." She nodded toward the chair. "Dinner's ready." They ate quietly. Halfway through the meal, Adrian placed his fork down. "I'm sorry." Grace looked at him. Not surprised. Just attentive. "I don't mean for the dinner. I mean for everything." His voice trembled. "I thought providing financially was enough. I thought because I earned the money, I was carrying the family." He shook his head. "I was wrong. You carried everything I never even noticed." Grace remained silent. "I've spent the last week discovering how much of my life only worked because of you." His eyes filled with tears. "I embarrassed you in front of people who should have seen how extraordinary you are. I erased years of sacrifice with one sentence." He swallowed hard. "And the worst part is, I believed it." Grace took a slow breath. "Thank you for finally telling the truth." He looked confused. "The truth? You believed it?" She nodded gently. "That's why it hurt." He lowered his head. "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. You shouldn't. I don't expect things to go back to normal. They won't. I only want a chance to become the husband you deserved all along." Grace studied him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, not to hold his hand, but to make one thing clear. "If we move forward, it won't be the way we lived before." Adrian nodded immediately. "I know. No." She met his eyes. "I don't think you do. I won't manage your schedule anymore. I won't carry the mental load alone. I won't sacrifice my dreams so yours can grow. I'm joining an art program next month. I'm volunteering twice a week. And from now on, we build this life together." Adrian didn't hesitate. Together. For the first time in years, that word meant something. Not because he said it. Because he finally understood it. Over the months that followed, their home changed. Adrian learned how many invisible tasks filled an ordinary week. He scheduled his own appointments. Shared the household responsibilities. Remembered birthdays. Paid bills on time. Asked Grace about her painting classes. Cheered when one of her landscapes was displayed in a local gallery. He wasn't perfect. Neither was she. But they had stopped keeping score. Months later, at another business awards dinner, Adrian was invited to the stage once again. The host smiled. "Before you leave, is there anyone you'd like to thank?" Adrian looked toward Grace, seated quietly at the back of the room. He stepped away from the microphone for a moment, walked down from the stage, and held out his hand. Surprised, Grace joined him. He led her back to the spotlight. "This award has my name on it," he said, his voice steady, but the life that made it possible was built by two people. He turned to Grace. I spent years celebrating my success and overlooking the person who made that success sustainable. I won't make that mistake again. The audience rose to its feet. This time, Grace smiled without forcing it. Not because everyone was applauding her, but because the one person whose recognition mattered most had finally learned that love is measured not only by what is earned, but by what is given every single day without being asked. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more powerful stories like this. And tell us in the comments, do you think Grace did the right thing by stepping back, or would you have handled it differently? Your thoughts could encourage someone going through a similar situation. Sometimes, the strongest foundation of a family isn't the person bringing home the paycheck. It's the one quietly making sure everyone else can stand.